Security is absolutely critical for wireless networks. As a network administrator, you should secure your wireless data by implementing authentication and encryption. We'll start with authentication because that's one of the first things that happens when you connect a device. The first is open system authentication, which requires a MAC address to connect to the wireless access point. By default, all MAC addresses are allowed. Open system authentication doesn't require the client system to provide its credentials to the access point, so any client system can send a request, be authenticated, and then connect in. Really, open system authentication isn't authentication at all, but you can implement a minimal level of security on your wireless access point or WAP by implementing MAC address filtering so that certain MAC addresses are rejected when they try to connect. The next type of authentication for wireless networking is 802.1x, which implements usernames and passwords. With 802.1x authentication, the authentication method is negotiated when a connection is established between the client and the WAP. The wireless access point itself doesn't perform the authentication. Instead, it forwards the credentials to a special server, for example, a Radius server. The Radius server maintains information about user accounts and conditions for access. Then, when the user logs on, the authentication information is passed to the server, which looks up the user account and validates the username or password. You may also use other information to impose additional restrictions. For example, you could implement time of day restrictions to restrict access to the wireless network during certain periods of the day. In the end, the Radius server sends information back to the access point to tell it whether the access is granted or denied. 802.1x authentication also requires certificates. The authentication server must have a certificate that identifies it as a server that's qualified to perform the authentication process. With 802.1x, you can also use methods other than usernames and passwords. For example, you could use a smart card to only allow access to users that have smart cards themselves. Implementing authentication is only one part of wireless network security. There's still a few more steps. Let's move on to encryption. To protect unencrypted channels, you need to encrypt all the signals on your wireless network. This protects it by encoding communications before they're transmitted. This way, even if someone captures the signal, there's nothing they can do with it because the data is encrypted. It's essentially useless to them. Encryption requires that senders and receivers have some type of key to encrypt and decrypt whatever they're sending. The third type of authentication is shared key authentication. This is a four-way challenge response handshake that occurs between the wireless client and the wireless access point, and it requires all wireless devices on the network to be pre-configured with the same key. First, the client sends an authentication request to the WAP. The access point replies to the workstation that wants to authenticate with a clear text challenge. Then the client encrypts the challenge text using the pre-configured pre-shared key and sends it back to the WAP in another authentication request. Finally, the access point decrypts the material it received and compares it with the clear text it sent in the first place. If the decryption process was accurate and the text is correct, the access point sends back a positive response, and the association between the client and the access point is created. If the decryption fails, it sends back a negative response and rejects the connection request. Next, let's look at WPA and WPA2. WPA stands for Wi-Fi Protected Access, and it uses what's called Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, or TKIP. WPA provides dynamic key generation and dynamic key rotation. This ensures that the network doesn't use the same key over and over. Instead, each packet gets a unique encryption key. TKIP uses Rivus Cipher 4 or RC4 to encase the data packets that are transferred. WPA also offers better authentication than older protocols because wireless clients have to authenticate to the wireless access point before they're allowed to connect. Unfortunately, even WPA is crackable. Exploits that can break WPA encryption are published on the internet. Whether these exploits are effective depends on one thing: the length of the passphrase you set up. If you use a very long passphrase with just regular WPA, it makes it harder to break. If you use a short passphrase, the encryption is much easier to crack. If you're going to set up a wireless network that has any type of secure information on it, you really should use WPA2. WPA2 provides the highest level of wireless security because it uses an encryption algorithm called Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES. AES is a more complex cipher than older ciphers, like RC4. AES can be used with either TKIP or Cipher Block Chaining Message Authentication Protocol, or CCMP, but the latter provides you with the highest level of security. CCMP is an improvement on TKIP for a few reasons. It has a larger block size for encryptions and a larger key size as well. It also has stronger algorithms that require more resources to run. Using CCMP in conjunction with AES ensures a higher level of security than TKIP and RC4. Both WPA and WPA2 support both open authentication and 802.1x authentication. 802.1x is typically used in larger organizations. This option requires additional hardware and more complex configuration tasks. Besides encryption and authentication, there are several other options you should consider for any wireless network you're in charge of. First, always be sure to change the default administrator password on your access points. Most wireless access points come pre-configured with a default administrator password to enable easy initial configuration. You should be aware that the default passwords for most access points are published on the internet and are easily accessible. This allows malicious individuals to connect to your wireless access point and change its configuration. Another thing you can do is change the default SSID, or better yet, disable SSID broadcasting completely. This technique obscures your wireless network so that casual observers can't detect it. But a more determined attacker can still detect the network and identify the SSID by capturing packets that are being exchanged. Another thing you can do is enable MAC address filtering. This option restricts access to the wireless network to only devices with specific MAC addresses that you've configured. Again, this makes your network harder to compromise, but it won't stop a determined hacker. The attacker can still monitor the radio signals from your network and identify MAC addresses that are allowed. Then they can reconfigure their own devices to use those allowed addresses. Another thing to do periodically is update your access points firmware. As security threats become known, manufacturers often release fixes that plug those holes. Finally, you can enable the firewall on your WAP to allow access to only certain IP addresses or devices, or allow communication in only certain directions. You can also limit access with geofencing. Geofencing is a virtual fence that allows devices to connect to a network based on their geographic location. You can determine which kind of access is given based on where someone is. You can also use radio frequency technology and GPS to know whether a device is within the geofence or not. Another important consideration for Wi-Fi security is antenna placement. Sometimes the easiest place to put an antenna is where it's close to existing infrastructure, like power outlets and network cables. A lot of times those are run through walls, including exterior walls. This can bring a sort of security problem if we put an antenna too close to an exterior wall. How close is too close? We could say that too close is any time that the wireless network is easy to access from the parking lot without special equipment. We fix this potential issue by moving the antenna away from exterior walls or toward the interior of the building. This weakens the signal strength on the outside. Remember that signal strength drops the farther you get from the transmitting antenna because of attenuation, absorption, reflection, and refraction. In other words, the farther it goes and the more stuff it has to go through, the less power the signal has and the harder it is for a potential attacker to exploit. Moving antenna away from exterior walls is a great way to reduce the power level being received outside the building, but it's not the only solution. We can also turn down the transmitter power level in the wireless access point itself. Naturally, this opens up the possibility of legitimate users getting weak signals if they're near the outer walls of the building. So we can compensate by adding more access points throughout each floor. This also gives us several additional benefits. From a network management perspective, we get a finer level of control by having a larger number of small zones instead of a small number of large zones. Load balancing and redundancy will improve. From a wireless security perspective, in addition to reducing signal leakage outside the intended areas, we have greater physical control of subnets through VLANs and software-defined networking. This brings us to the idea of isolation. Isolation plays a critical role in cybersecurity in general, especially in wireless security. If basic network segmentation practices had been in place, the infamous Target credit card database theft in 2013 wouldn't have happened. In wireless security, one of the first types of isolation we need to consider is guest network isolation. A guest network itself should be isolated from an enterprise's production network. Guest networks should have visible SSIDs so visitors can find them and access them using the appropriate local procedures. But the production network SSID should remain hidden to stop casual hackers from attempting to break in. We accomplish this by configuring the wireless LAN controller for two networks, the production network and the guest network, each with its own access privileges. So what do we do if a wireless client isn't safe and secure? Do we let it join the network or deny access? Wireless client isolation helps us keep unsafe devices off our networks. This isn't just about our guest networks, which have very little access to resources. Often it's just the internet and maybe a printer. This is about our company-owned laptops, tablets, phones, and other portable and mobile devices. Workers who don't travel for business a lot keep their company laptops locked up in a drawer or cabinet for weeks or even months at a time. Devices that aren't up to date with patches, updates, and scans shouldn't be allowed on the production network. But it's a bit of a conundrum, as they still need some sort of access to be updated. The last thing we'll talk about under the topic of isolation is our Internet of Things devices. As we see the explosion in popularity of IoT devices like smart thermostats, smart lighting solutions, and smart appliances, we need to consider how to protect our network. While things are improving, many IoT device manufacturers aren't cybersecurity experts. They're device manufacturing experts who just add networking to devices. How easy is it to hack an IoT device? The answer to that question varies, since some devices are very secure, whereas others will at some point be found to have exploitable vulnerabilities. We've talked about devices the company owns, but what about when we bring our own things to work with us? BYOD, or Bring Your Own Device, brings with it a unique set of challenges. First, though, what do we mean by bring your own device? A BYOD policy is a corporate policy that governs workers bringing their own phones, tablets, or even laptops to work and connecting them to the network. To address these challenges, we need to ask a few questions about each device. First, who owns it? In the case of BYOD, that's an easy answer. The owner does. But we still need to ask the question because there are local, state, and national laws that govern who can do what with what. Asking this question helps us understand the legal responsibilities of both the owner of the device and the owner of the network. Next, we need to know who controls it. Again, we have legal considerations here. Does the company have a legal right to make requirements on a personally owned device? Can a worker refuse to have an employer inspect their phone? From a technological perspective, we have to ask, which kind is it? This is very important because of the vast number of mobile and portable device manufacturers out there. We could say something like, we'll allow you to connect Apple and Samsung phones and tablets to the network because they're the two biggest manufacturers on the market. But we're not going to make our IT department become experts on Motorola, Nokia, and Kyocera, and all the rest. We could also say, this company uses Windows 10 on our company computers, so you can bring Windows 10 laptops to work, but we won't support Mac OS or Linux. After we have answers to these questions, we ask the biggest question of all. Will we allow these devices to connect to our production network? If we do allow it, we have to have proper security measures in place. We have to mandate anti-malware, firewall settings, acceptable use policies, and so forth to be totally secure in our workplace. If the answer to that last question is no, we still have to decide if we'll allow people to connect to a guest network. That might seem like a silly question. After all, isn't the guest network for everyone? Actually, no, not always. Sometimes a guest network still requires credentials of some sort, and it still needs to have security and acceptable use policies. So, as you can see, BYOD challenges are real and really important.